Hi, this is Brent Bozell with the Brent Bozell Show. We are living in truly consequential times for the Republic, but we're also in virgin territory in that we are living in a system that is unlike any other, and we need help in trying to figure this out. So today we're going to talk about lawfare and what's happening in this country. We basically are down to two branches of government. The legislative branch doesn't function anymore. With the one exception of Obamacare, we really haven't seen anything of consequence coming out of the House or the Senate. The Republicans don't know what they stand for anymore, I believe. But they do have enough people that they can stop the Democrats who do know what they're doing and have an agenda that is frightening from my standpoint. What we've had is a judiciary that on the one hand is doing very good things, I think, but on the other hand is doing frightening things. The good things is keeping a system of checks and balances on the executive power. The Obama administration on a regular basis was doing one regulatory excess after another, and the courts were ruling time and again by 9-0, unanimous votes that Obama had gone too far. Trump had to use the same kind of regulatory authority to undo a lot of what Obama did. Biden is now back to doing what Obama was doing. I find it fascinating that the Democrats are screaming that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. What they're not reminding you of is the fact that they tried to keep Donald Trump off the ballot in 36 states. And it was only the court that stopped them, again, by a 9-0 vote. But now you've seen the left decide they're going to use the judiciary in ways they've never done it before. They have one simple goal this year: keep Donald Trump in a courtroom and be able to call him a convicted felon. That they've achieved with the case in New York. We saw them for 6 weeks keeping him on stuck to his chair where he wasn't able to go out and campaign. The American people saw that. They reacted by increasing the support for Trump. But the Democrats are asking how long can he maintain that? And I think it's a good strategy on their part. Okay, so what has just happened is an immunity decision where the president has been given immunity for official acts. And the question that I'm going to ask my guest is how that is going to affect the elections or affect the trials going forward. Tom Fitton is, I think, speaking of consequential, one of the most consequential leaders in the conservative movement. He's the president of Judicial Watch. He's the president of the Council for National Policy. He was named, I disagree with this, Tom. He was named by the Hill newspaper one of the top 10 most effective government watchdog organizations. I don't believe that's true. I would put Judicial Watch in the top 3. And I mean that quite seriously. If you go back to the Obama years and look back at all the hearings that were held, they were held because of Judicial Watch and Tom Fitton and the FOIAs. So I want to ask Tom a series of questions that will hopefully clarify this legal morass. First, from the macro, the immunity decision, how is that going to affect the attacks on Trump going forward?
Well, I think it makes it nearly impossible for the prosecutions directly against Trump to proceed, Brent. And I appreciate, just before I get going here, your kind words of introduction. And the decision somewhat mitigates the effort to interfere in the election through these processes. So when you think about it, there are 4 cases, right? You had the Bragg case, which was the so-called hush money case. You have the January 6th election interference case down here in Washington, D.C., similar case at the state level in Georgia by Fani Willis, and then this documents case in Miami also being pursued by Jack Smith before Judge Cannon. I think all of those cases have been wrecked by the Supreme Court decision yesterday. Essentially, the court said there are these core issues that the president engages in: foreign policy, decision-making about hiring and firing, communications with his Justice Department officials, and things like that. You know, he's immune from prosecution for doing his basic work as president. And there are other issues that are official acts that he's presumptively immune. And it's that category in which almost all of these cases fall into. And the court said in order to kind of overcome that presumption of immunity for criminal prosecution, you can't jail a president simply for being president. You've got to make some strong showings here. And the court's got to analyze that carefully even before they allow the proceedings to get off the ground. So what does that mean? It means that Trump up in New York has asked the court there, hey, look, the evidence you used against me to try to convict me, that was evidence from my days as president of the United States, Oval Office conversations. You know, this is obviously covered by the Supreme Court decision, and you know, basically the case has to be looked at all over again from the get-go. January 6th case here in D.C., same issue. They have to go through this careful analysis now, according to the Supreme Court, about whether they can burst through the president's presumed immunity. And what President Trump's going to say, of course, as president, I have a duty to ensure the election was conducted fairly, and that the succession of the presidency wasn't compromised by illicit votes and misconduct and other things. And that included talking to my vice president, which of course presumably is covered as well, and advocating for alternative slates of electors. You know, that's a tough hurdle for Jack Smith to overcome. In Georgia, that's essentially another January 6th case, same issue. And then, of course, that case has already had problems because of Fani Willis's corruption. And then down in Florida with that presidential records case, his decision to take those presidential records or designate them as personal, whatever the argument is, when did that decision take place? When he was president. So again, that case may be ended sooner rather than later as a result of this decision.
Okay.
Now, on the other hand,
go ahead. You got one more, right?
Yeah, I think that covers all four of the cases.
All right, so let's go back to Bragg for a moment. I think it's mind-boggling that you had a case where the charge wasn't delivered until the closing arguments, where the judge gave the jury basically an Easter basket of options with which to convict Trump. And I think most importantly, and overlooked, there is no way that Donald Trump could get a fair trial in Manhattan. There's just no way. This should never have been allowed to be in that town. I believe, looking at it, there's a reason why it's been postponed from July 11th to September 18th. And I think it's interesting that the judge said, words to the effect, if necessary. So I think he's already hedging his bets on this. What was your reaction as an expert watching 6 weeks of a prosecution of Donald Trump where no one knew what the actual charge was, because it had to be tied, one had to be tied to another, and no one knew what the other was. Presumptively, it was a federal case, and yet the federal government had twice declined to prosecute it. So what was your reaction watching this thing go on for 6 weeks?
To me, it was a political hostage situation. It was a sham trial, as you highlighted, were charges about nothing. He really didn't know what the charges were against him, and so he couldn't really fully defend himself. And It was done by a Democrat politician, Bragg, a Democrat donor, a Biden donor, Merchant. And it's going to go down in infamy in terms of our judicial system as one of the worst and politicized trials in our country's history. I can't think of anything comparable, given the importance of the defendant, the former president, number one candidate for office. And it was conducted with the help and under the direction, largely, it looks like, of a former top official in the Biden administration who slithered over from the Biden Justice Department to the New York Attorney General's office and then down to Bragg in their pursuit of Trump. So it doesn't get much more political than that. And the jurisdiction issue is just icing on the cake in terms of having a jury that was never going to give him a fair hearing. And the jury, to me, the process was abused. That jury, was the lipstick on a pig, right? It was still a pig underneath, and the jury was brought in to kind of lend an air of validity to the entire process. And I denounce that verdict. I denounce that process. And my concern is, as I think about all these cases, especially that 6 weeks of Trump being held hostage and the campaign being held hostage. By the way, that gag order is still out there, so he's still under restriction.
Okay. So
the election's been compromised already, and the question is the nature of the compromise so great that it will impact the result in a way that undermines the confidence of the people in whatever the outcome is?
Are we to assume that if he is sentenced on September 18th and sentenced to prison, that they would appeal it and therefore the campaign would continue? Or do you think that there is a possibility, maybe not a probability, but a possibility that they could put him in prison and say he couldn't get out until the appeals process made its way done, went through? Do you think that could ever happen?
I think that's what they want to happen. The Supreme Court has made it much more difficult for them to get that accomplished. I don't see, how even a dishonest lawyer could get around that decision and the process the Supreme Court put in place in order to adjudicate this immunity question. So I think it's back to the drawing board for Bragg if they follow the Supreme Court precedent, and if they don't, Trump may have. And I'm not a lawyer, so but this is just based on my understanding of the way the process has worked thus far. Trump has a strong argument to go to the federal court and seek some type of intervention, or immediately appeal any sentencing. Okay. So the fact that it's been delayed as long as you say, to me, is an indication that Merchant knows that he may have to go back to the drawing board as well.
Okay, so let's get in the car and let's drive south. Let's go to Florida, sunny Florida, where you and I were last week. By the way, you had a fantastic conference in Florida. You had some great speakers. So congratulations to you. Okay, but we're in Florida right now, and now we've got this documents case. I think the public sees first and foremost that you've got documents that Donald Trump had, but you also had documents that Joe Biden had. And Joe Biden is not being prosecuted. Donald Trump has been indicted. Not only that, but with Joe Biden, you just happen to catch them in the garage in a box. With Donald Trump, they were neatly laid out by the FBI for all of America to see, including classified documents to see. So two questions I've got for you. Number one, am I right about the political nature of the two competing cases? And number two, well, let me just ask you number one, then I'll go to number two.
You sure are. I mean, I go back to, our sock drawer case, the infamous Clinton sock drawer case, where there were tapes Clinton had that were obviously government records or records of his presidency, because they recorded him as president, making calls in the Oval Office to foreign leaders and members of Congress and such. And we sought those records under with the National Archives. And the archives, the Justice Department, and the most liberal court in this city told us to pound sand. No one can second guess the president. He has unreviewable authority to designate records as personal versus presidential. Even if they are classified, he can unclassify them, essentially. That was the gravamen of the case. And so when the whole records issue popped up with Trump, we're like, what is going on here? They've done a 180. And then sure enough, to further prove the point, Biden gets caught up in the same law. Arguably, it protects him the way it would have protected Trump, but it doesn't protect him as a senator from taking classified records. And what did Hur find? He found two very interesting reasons, among others, for not prosecuting Trump. He had no memory, essentially dementia. And secondly, Biden thought he had a right to the records, and it was reasonable that he thought so. And that's the reason not to prosecute him. Why isn't that deference given to Trump? I mean, it goes to the heart of the case. Trump had a right to the records. Well, as a matter of prior practice and such. Hur went through all of that, and yet Biden gets a free pass.
Yeah, you know, but Tom, on the Hur side of things, going to that, I think people may be overlooking something. That there's another reason that Jim Jordan and company want to hear those tapes. It's not just because of what Joe Biden possibly, honestly can't remember because of cognitive memory loss, but it might also be lying on his part, where he is pretending not to remember things, when in fact you could find the evidence that he might or might not. So I think it's both sides. But the second point I wanted to make to you was this. I've been asking myself the question all along, to what end? Joe Biden had all of his documents because he was going to have a ghostwriter write a book. And I think that's probably defensible. And he just had some that were just lying around there, and he didn't remember he had them because they weren't of consequence. But I don't know that anyone has suggested that there was anything nefarious that Donald Trump was going to do with his documents. So to me, there's got to be a reason for having taken them illegally. Has anybody come up with that nefarious, alleged reason he did it?
No, and that's a good point. Biden had an $8 million book deal. My impression is Trump got documents because he wanted mementos. He would see a classified record, he'd bring it up to his residence and throw it in a box. And those boxes ultimately were not only moved from the Trump White House, but from the Biden administration. The GSA sent records, it looks like, when Biden was office to Trump's place in Mar-a-Lago. So who's responsible for that? You know, on these audio tapes, we've asked for, you may know we have this big lawsuit over it, and Heritage has sued, and CNN, all the media organizations have sued subsequent to our filing the lawsuit. They've come back to us and said, well, his privacy needs to be protected. They've come back to us and said, well, if we release these audio tapes, AI can be used to manipulate the content and put out disinformation. They want to break FOIA in order to protect Joe. So I don't know what's on those tapes, but it must be not helpful to Joe Biden, because they've come up with a series of legal arguments that Garland is willing to go into contempt of Congress to protect the release of it. You know, so presume the worst, right, in terms of what the content shows.
Once again, I think, Tom, that common sense rules here. If they had nothing to hide, they would release them. There's something on those tapes that they know is going to hurt Joe Biden. Either that a cognitive disability that he's got, or the fact that he's being dishonest, or maybe a combination of the two. But there's something definitely going on with those tapes. Okay, we're get in our car. We're going to go north. We're going to go to Atlanta now. And now there's another case against Joe Biden, where somehow he tried to steal the elections in Georgia. Walk us through what the argument that Fani Willis and her boyfriend have. What's the key to the argument that they have against him, and what you think this immunity decision will have on that argument?
Well, I mean, they're suggesting is that Trump's efforts to ensure the election was conducted fairly in Georgia and subsequent efforts to have alternative slates of electors put in place, which has been typical for 100 plus 150 years in this country, fights about electors and which will be selected and which won't, were illegal. And it's an echo of what they're doing up here in Washington, D.C., that the president didn't have a right to dispute the election, and his efforts to do so were a violation of state law. And one of the key arguments, and the court is now going to require the court in Georgia to go through it looks like, that Supreme Court decision, is the question of his immunity. As president, did he have prerogatives to raise issues about what was going on in Georgia? And I think you can't conclude anything other than he did. And I don't know how you separate his political interest from his personal interest from his interest as a president. And the Supreme Court said you can't get into his motives. This is, you can't file a criminal case against the former president or president for alleged crimes as a government official and use that as a pretext to start questioning him about what he was thinking when he was running the country.
Right.
The Supreme Court said that's going to be the end of our system if that's allowed to take place.
Do you have a sense of when this trial is slated to begin, and how long is he going to be sitting in a courtroom?
Well, in Georgia, that case has kind of been is really hanging up in the appellate court now because of the question of Fani Willis's corruption and whether she should have been removed, her office removed because of her involvement with her hire and boyfriend Nathan Wade. And the court there said, well, Wade can't be on the case anymore, but don't worry, Fani can. And Trump and others have appealed that, and that's being given careful consideration. So. And if she's taken off the case and her office is taken off the case, that may be the end of the case completely. It may be that no one else takes it up in Georgia.
I'm not spinning this for President Trump. However, again, a common sense reflection. At the core of this, you've got that infamous phone call between the president and I believe it was the Secretary of State saying, "Find me 1,400 votes," and that's seems to be the key of the argument of trying to steal the elections, invent 1,400 votes for me. But in fact, the Trump campaign was absolutely convinced it had won by several 100,000 votes. Couldn't the argument, or won't the argument be made by the Trump legal team that what he was saying in that phone call was, all you need to do is find 1,400 out of several 100,000 and it's over? You think he's going to make that argument? Because I would.
Yeah, and I think the number was even bigger. It was like 12,000. My understanding of the context, it was like another perfect phone call as far as I was concerned, is that they were trying to get the Secretary of State to get off his you-know-what and investigate what went on. And Trump was saying, this is so close. I'm just 12,000 votes away. It's too close for you not to do anything. That's not a direction to go, you need to go find me votes because I want to steal the election. He was highlighting the closeness of the race to motivate the state officials to do the job they were supposed to do, which is to assure that votes were counted lawfully and only lawful votes were counted.
Yeah, there's supposedly a presumption of innocence in America today. There's been no such thing with Donald Trump in any of these cases. There's been a desire for a conviction. However you can get that conviction, however you can make it work. This is a Democratic Party, Tom, that I think, lies through its teeth. They lie about Donald Trump being a liar. A day doesn't go by where I don't see Kamala Harris as saying that Donald Trump wants to end all abortions. No matter how you fall on the life issue, that's not his position. Or in the Georgia case specifically, running a whole campaign saying that the Republicans, with their Voting Rights Act, wanted to stop people from having the ability to vote. And the Biden campaign is still saying that to this day, when in fact what the Republicans were advancing was only two things. One was photo ID, and the other one was signature verification. The two most obvious things in the voting process. What does it say to you, Tom, that the left, that these people who are prosecuting Trump lie with impunity? There's no presumption of innocence, and there's no adherence to judicial principle. It is a political attempt to put this guy in prison, and if not, just to keep him in a courtroom. Am I exaggerating?
No, and I think that the issue is what's escalated, obviously, in the last few years. It's one thing to have an argument about what Trump did. You know, politicians get accused of lying all the time. That argument works both ways, and that's just politics. It's another thing to say, you can't dispute what happened, because if you do, I'll throw you in jail. So if you exercise your First Amendment rights, or as the Supreme Court highlights, your presumptive rights as president of the United States, we're going to criminalize that. We're going to throw you in jail for being president, or petitioning your government in Georgia as a candidate, or as a state party. You see this in various battleground states. The Democrats are going after state party officials who were trying to organize these alternative electors so that they would have an argument in Congress if push came to shove and there was a dispute. Standard operating procedures in election challenges. And they're essentially trying to criminalize the election process. And it's as much about 2024 and future elections as it is about 2020. And I tell you, if any lawyer who's involved on the Republican side of things, or conservative activists who want to get involved at the state level in counting votes and at the election level, they must be thinking, are they going to try to throw me in jail if I stand up against what I perceive to be illicit conduct? And they'd be right to be thinking that.
That's absolutely true. Okay, so the final case. We're getting back in our car. Now we're going up to Washington, D.C. for the J6 trial. Let's start with this simple proposition on my part and ask you to comment on it. I would propose Donald Trump is guilty before the trial begins, for the simple reason that the setting is Washington, D.C., and there's absolutely no way. I think the city voted 94% against him. It's not that they disagree with the policies of Donald Trump. This is personal. They hate him. You and I are in the D.C. area. We know this. They despise him in Washington, D.C. Am I right or am I wrong that he's guilty before the trial starts?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think this he's been denied many key due process rights. And look, the Supreme Court found the Justice Department engaged in an unconstitutional prosecution of him by not respecting his immunity that he had as president of the United States under the Constitution. That is, that the court didn't just discover yesterday, but applied, that has been in place since the beginning of our Constitution. It was implicit in the way presidents have been treated. There's a reason no president has been prosecuted for official acts while they were president, because they didn't think it could be done. That's what the Supreme Court found. And you had this willingness not only by the Biden gang. Remember, there was a hesitancy to do this, and the left pushed and pushed and pushed, and then Garland finally caved. So the Biden gang did it. Jack Smith came in and acted as their front for this operation, and the left-wing courts here in D.C. ratified it. It's just a terrible collapse of our system. And, you know, this anti-Trump animus is ruining our judicial system where it's, especially in D.C., where it's so infected so much of the court thinking on this.
And if the court ever votes in favor of a Donald Trump position, then they will rue the day. Sotomayor, I think it was, saying that the immunity case now gives Donald Trump or a future president the right to assassinate a political opponent. Even Chief Justice Roberts called her on the carpet for that one. Back on the January 6th case, I have sensed that the political agenda is one of framing this case in a truly dishonest fashion. The suggestion and the narrative that's being pushed is that Trump and the Trump campaign was trying to seat an alternate slate of electors. But in fact, this is a process that's taken place since time immemorial, where the losing candidate wants its electors placed on there, and it protests electors that are on there. Again, am I right or am I wrong on this one? That especially the media are playing this game, that somehow what he was trying to do, and again, you agree with Mike Pence, disagree with Mike Pence. I think it's irrelevant. I think that Mike Pence had the right to say that he couldn't do anything about this election, and Donald Trump had the right to say, oh, yes, you can, and I want to protest. The protest got out of control. We know that. But does Donald Trump not have the basic right to protest an election?
Of course he does, as president, as a candidate, and as a citizen. And he didn't do anything differently than that has been done, as you point out, in previous history. And, you know, I was called in to testify as a witness in this case. And I remember sitting there before the grand jury, and we were arguing this issue about electors. And I said, look at what happened in 1960 in Hawaii. They had set up alternate slates of electors. But I guess that's okay, and it's not when Trump does it. And I highlighted to them in 2020, the Democrats were planning, if Trump won, to seat alternative slates of electors. And their thinking was they were wargaming the scenario that states would threaten to secede from the Union unless they got the electors they wanted seated. Now, isn't that a conspiracy against whatever it is that we're supposed to be against by the Democrats at that time? And so I remember thinking, sitting there before the grand jury, so why am I being questioned about this political fight? I mean, it was a political fight. And I'm being questioned about First Amendment related activity, core to Judicial Watch's activities, and core to the role of the President of the United States in ensuring that the laws are faithfully executed.
Well, I'll tell you why. Tom. You and I have known each other for many years. You know I'm not a conspiratorialist. You're not a conspiratorialist. But I truly do believe that the left is saying to itself, if we can get President Trump, we can get anybody. And I truly do believe that they have a pecking order. And Judicial Watch is on it because you are a true thorn in their side. I hope you have good lawyers. I know you have good lawyers. But you, my friend, you've got to concern yourself with the fact that they'll come after you, they'll come after us, they'll come after anybody that is getting in their way. These guys are playing for keeps. So one last thing, we'll wrap this up. Let's end this on a positive note. Where are you going to be, and are you going to be eating popcorn or drinking bourbon when President Trump announces to the world after he wins, oh, the hell with it, I'm pardoning myself on everything, and go pound sand? Think of the left reaction and ask yourself, are you going to be eating popcorn or are you going to be drinking bourbon and truly enjoying yourself? Because I think that's within the realm of possibilities. I believe Donald Trump has it in him to give the middle finger to the left after all of this and say, okay, you want to play, I'm playing, I'm pardoned. And there's nothing you can do about it.
If I were him, I'd write the most expansive pardon document in the history of the country to ensure that he's not prosecuted. Update it day by day to ensure he can't be prosecuted, because they're going to come after him again. And I would also, to follow up, I'd pardon all those targeted on January 6th, every one of them. It was selective prosecution, each and every one of them, marred by bad faith in politics. So all that should be erased. And I would appoint a special prosecutor to investigate those who were targeting him, abusing him and other innocent Americans, abusing their civil rights under the color of law, and have that special prosecutor work out of Florida, separate and apart from the Justice Department and the FBI, and just go to town, figuring out what went on. And on top of that, obviously, he's got to clean house at both agencies and rethink about what form they remain in at the end of his presidency.
Tom, that's perfectly put, and we'll end it there. Tom Fitton, the president of Judicial Watch, and you know, I made this statement at your event last week. I judge people and organizations by asking myself, where would we be without them? And I really shudder to think where the conservative movement would be without Judicial Watch and without you. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Brent. Appreciate that.
I want to invite you as my guest on a very special, once-in-a-lifetime, 7-day post-election cruise in the Caribbean. It's going to be a blast.